Hey everybody, and welcome to the Fillers Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. This is part of a video series where I'm showing you how to quilt some of my favorite filler designs. In this video, we're going to be talking about clamshells. Clamshells are one of those classic traditional designs that looks great on your quilts. However, there are a lot of different variations that you can create with it, from the basket weave to some little bricks, as well as combining it with other designs. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create several different fillers, and I'm going to show you how to quilt it on a sewing machine and a long arm. Plus, I'll give you tips and tricks to work your way around the area. So, let's get started. The clamshell quilting design is a classic, traditional design that looks great over your whole quilt. However, we're going to switch it up a bit by incorporating some swirls to create little pops of texture with our clamshells. It's a really fun way to quilt your quilts, so let me show you how to do it. The clamshells design is going to build off of a boundary, so whether that's the edge of my area or a marked line, I need some kind of reference to start quilting my clamshells. Before we start talking about mixing in swirls, let's just quilt a couple rows of clamshells to see what that looks like. I'm still going to quilt my arc. I'm going to continue on quilting arcs until I hit the edge of my area. I'm just eyeballing them, trying to make them all the same size, knowing that when I'm finished, it's going to look fine. However, if the thought of that makes you super nervous, you could either mark out your clamshells or mark a boundary line above it so you know how high to make them. Ultimately, do whatever you will do to continue on. Well, now that I have my first row quilted, I want to quilt my second row, but I need to be intentional about the placement of them. I want the second row of arcs to land in the middle of the first row. That's what's going to give it that staggered kind of look. So I'm going to travel along the edge until I get to a point that I can land on the middle of the next one, and I'm going to work my way back across, quilting my clamshells, trying as hard as I can to land where I want them to go. If you wanted to, you can continue quilting your clamshells so that they stack on top of each other. But sometimes connecting them and dealing with all that can be a little bit of a hassle. So let me show you how you can use some quilting to break them up a bit. It's one of my favorite ways to use this design. All right, I'm going to start by quilting 3 or 4 clamshells, aiming for the middle of the row below and stopping after I've quilted a few. Now we know that we need to travel to get to the next row, but earlier we traveled on the edge of the area. Here we're going to travel along the previously quilted clamshell to get to the middle point. Now I'm on my second row and I'm going to quilt my clamshells until I reach the edge. So what's going to happen is as I quilt my rows of clamshells, each one is going to get one clamshell shorter. So as I backtrack along that one I've quilted and at my next row, I'm only going to quilt a couple, eventually ending with just one clamshell on top. And now I have my little grouping of clamshells, my little cute little pod of those, and I'm going to fill in all the rest of the space to either side of it with a filler design. I'm going to use swirls because I love how that looks, but you could use any particular design. So I'm going to fill into one side of it, then work my way over and fill in all the rest. And then once I have that area filled in, I can either continue quilting my filler or add some more clamshells. Now since I'm starting to run out of room on this block, I'm just going to keep quilting my swirly filler. However, let's go to the long arm and I'll show you what it looks like if you want to combine multiple sections of those clamshells. I'm going to start just by quilting a few clamshells, just like I did before. I'm going to backtrack along that clamshell and add a couple more clamshells. I'm going to end up with one little clamshell on top, and I'm going to use the quilting to fill in the rest of the area to the side of the clamshells. As I'm filling in that area, I want it to be roughly the same height because I'm going to use that as my next boundary to add my next section of clamshells. Then I'm going to repeat using my filler to fill in any of those gaps. You can use whatever filler you like, but I prefer to use wavy lines and elongated swirls just because they're easier to build those clamshells off of. But I bet if you experiment with some different fillers, you can probably come up with some cool variations. And as you progress through the area, use your filler to fill in any gaps, and then add your little groups of clamshells as you see fit. And what you're going to get is a beautiful, whimsical design that's definitely going to add interest and detail to areas of your quilt. I prefer to use this design in more medium-sized areas. However, you could definitely use it in bigger areas as well. Since it needs a little bit of room to develop, I'm not going to be able to really fit this in those tiny areas. And while it would look nice on traditional quilts, I think this is going to be more of a design that I would use on novelty quilts, landscape quilts, especially looks fun on panels and things like that. However, play around with it and I'm sure you'll find the variation that you love. Instead of quilting the round curvy clamshell, we're going to square off that shape and make a brick-like texture. Sometimes when I want to add a pop of texture or a little bit of detail to a more realistic quilt, this is just the thing to go for. So just like the clamshell design, I need a boundary to build off of. Once I have that established starting point, I'm going to start quilting little box shapes. So going up, over, and down. Now from that point, I'm going to bounce right back up and repeat quilting that shape across the area. Now while this design does incorporate a little bit of traveling, if you go right into that line and right back up, chances are you'll be able to hit it pretty close. And even if they spread apart a little bit, it's still going to look fine. What I'm really aiming for is that more boxy kind of shape to look like bricks, and I'm trying to roughly kind of make them all the same height. But just like we saw with the clamshell, to move on to the next row, I need to travel along the edge, and I'm going to quilt my next row of bricks so that they hit the middle of the previous one. Now this is a lot more forgiving than the clamshell because even if they don't hit perfectly, it's still going to be fine. And just like the clamshell, I'm trying to eyeball it and keep those rows the same height. However, if you wanted to, maybe marking a guideline will give you something to aim for. And once I run into the edge of the area, I'm going to travel along the side and then repeat, working my way back the direction I came. Even though this design uses straight lines to create that boxy shape, I'm not using a ruler. They're short enough that I can get it straight-ish. And really, this design looks just as good, whether they're perfectly straight or a little bit more wonky. Now you can change up the scale of this design, of course, by making the size of your boxes bigger or smaller. However, I like to quilt it a little bit on the smaller side because I love to use it to add detail to areas of my quilt. This design is going to work great in smaller areas, but maybe not irregularly shaped areas. I'm not going to try fitting this in the background of a star block. However, round blocks in the background is a great idea, especially if you're working with a block-based quilt that has more of a realistic look. It's also a great way to add texture to a quilt panel as well. This is one of those designs that you might not use all the time, but there's going to be those quilts that pop up that you're going to be like, yes, that's perfect. I'm using a contrasting thread color so you can really see the quilting that I'm doing here. However, with this design and all the other ones I'm showing you in this video, you're going to get a more beautiful texture if your thread color matches the background fabric. And what I really, really love about this design is once you get the hang of it and you get into the flow of quilting it, it just becomes really mindless and your mind can kind of wander. Well, now that we've seen how that goes together, let me show you a couple of easy ways you can switch up the design on your long arm. For an even more whimsical, random look to this design, you can quilt all your little bricks so that they're different heights and different widths. It's just going to give it a different texture and a different shape. And hey, if you're struggling with keeping them all the same size, you're going to find this way easier. But everything else we've already learned still applies. I'm still quilting my shapes in a row, traveling along the edge, and adding my next row. When you're mixing up the sizes, it's not quite as important that they all land at the halfway mark of the row below. You can kind of just make it up as you go. And when I'm finished, I have a design that adds that little bit of detail, that beautiful texture to areas of my quilt that need an extra little touch. This next design is called the basket weave, and it adds a nice little bit of detail and texture to your quilt, and it's perfect for those smaller areas. If you want to be sure that your arcs are all the same size on the basket weave design, you can use the Design with Line stencils to quickly and easily mark a guideline. To create this design, I just need two basic shapes, an arc and a little bit of traveling. So running along one edge of my area, I'm going to quilt a little arc, very similar to a clamshell. But instead of going onto my next arc, I'm going to backtrack along the line I just quilted and then quilt my next arc branching out from there. So I'll repeat doing that, quilting my arc and traveling until I reach the edge of my area. And there I have my first row of arcs. Now to quilt the next one, I'm going to travel along the edge and repeat, except I'm going to be moving the opposite direction. This is kind of a whimsical shape, so it's not something that has to be overly perfect. I'm not worried that my arcs are all the same size. I'm not even worried if the second row echoes the bottom row or not. I just want to create that tiny bit of texture and that subtle shape. Now, depending on the look you're going for, you might want your arcs to be a little bit taller, like I have here. Or if you want a more dense option, you can do some echoing. I'm going to quilt that next row closer, and that's going to give me that look of echoing around it. The main difference with this variation is now I'm paying close attention to that previously quilted row because that is acting as the guide for my echoing. This is a great option if you want a more uniform look to your quilting. Maybe you're not going for that nice overall texture, maybe you're putting this detail on a part of the quilt that you want to be uniform. Quilting each row so that it echoes is going to give you that uniform look. You can change the scale of this design by changing the size of your little arcs or your clamshells. However, I think this design tends to look best quilted on a slightly smaller scale. So quilting that initial arc, I don't know, about 1 inch wide is about as big as I would go with it. But I have to point out, that's just my personal preference. As you work with this design, you might find different ways to quilt it that you like better. I have to admit, I think it looks a little bit better when they're not all perfectly the same size. I'm telling you, just go for it because this design is fun and easy and looks great no matter what it looks like. This video is actually a part of the Fillers Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. So to watch the other designs in the series, just check the link in the description box below. It'll show you all the other videos as well as tell you how you can get free quilting diagrams or even an expanded resource PDF with even more tips and quilting diagrams.